Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name's Ashley Remkus if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Wednesday, April the 20th, and today we're talking about a story that our own reporter, Ashley Remkus, published this morning, and that is kind of a follow-up on the case of William Ben Darby. Now, if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because Darby was a Huntsville cop in 2018 when he shot and killed a man, and last year he was convicted of murder for that shooting. Now, the former police chief of Huntsville and the Huntsville mayor have stood by Ben Darby through that trial and through his conviction. But Ashley's reporting this morning kind of told a little bit of a different side of that story. The Huntsville police chief, again, the former police chief there, still says he supports Darby and kind of doubles down on why he offers that support. So Ashley, today we're going to talk a little bit about this story, about the support, but I think most importantly about this policy that, again, former Chief Mark McMurray says Darby didn't violate. Ashley, how do you not violate a policy but then are convicted of murder?
So yeah, Ivana, that's sort of the question that Mark McMurray, the recently retired chief from Huntsville, raised. He wrote a letter to the Alabama Attorney General saying that essentially there were some apparent incongruities there. The Huntsville Police Department's Internal Review Board had determined back in 2018 that Officer Darby did not violate any policies in the shooting. And then, of course, the DA brought these murder charges. So how could that happen? Obviously, there's disagreement on the various sides about that. And so I just put the question to the former chief, is it possible that the review board just got it wrong? Is it possible that the officer really did violate policy? And so that there's not actually a conflict between, the state law under which he was convicted and the training that the department does. Now, former Chief McMurray didn't really directly answer that question. He just said that state authorities had told him that there was no need to change the police department's policy. But I think that the prosecutors in the case, the legal experts who have looked at it, I think they would say that the question is, did the city's review board get it wrong?
So I think that there's a lot to unpack there. Number one, again, the chief at the time, he's former chief now, the chief at the time, Mark McMurray, said the internal review board after that April 2018 shooting said that Darby did not violate policy. He stood by his officer. Then we fast forward, Darby is charged with murder. Throughout that time, Darby remained on the city's payroll. He did not quit and he was not fired. He then was convicted of murder, resigned from his position, and again, wasn't necessarily fired. He resigned. And then again, you've still got Mark McMurray, now the former police chief, standing by him saying, well, he didn't violate policy. Now, you mentioned Attorney General Marshall, and I think what's interesting, especially the way you lead into your reporting this morning, is that Steve Marshall received a letter allegedly from former Chief McMurray saying, look, if Darby was convicted and our policies were right, do we need to change policy? He says that he did not get a response letter from Marshall, but we know that he also said Marshall told him something later on that said, no, you don't need to change your policy. Ashley, what's really interesting to me about that, there's a lot of interesting things, but the kind of nugget I pull out of that is that Darby is appealing his conviction, right? If you follow the appeals process, and I know that a lot of people probably aren't as familiar with that, but when you start appealing that process, the Attorney General's office is the one that represents the state in that appeal. It's not those local prosecutors in Madison County or in any of the local counties where you're convicted. So the Attorney General's office, the state, Steve Marshall's office, is defending the conviction when supposedly AG Marshall is telling McMurray, no, you don't need to change your policies. That seems like a very murky situation.
Well, so the Attorney General's office has already responded to Darby's appeal. This is included in the story, but for a little background, essentially on his appeal, what Officer Darby's attorneys are arguing is that because the courtroom was closed to the public because of COVID protocols, that was a violation of his right, to a public trial. Of course, the trial was live streamed into a different room at the courthouse for the public and also a separate room in the courthouse for the press. Though there were some points where, the audio would cut out or the video feed had not been turned back on until like somebody had already started testifying. Or if there were like issues that the judge was discussing with the attorneys, normally in a courtroom, we might be able to hear those things in the press or members of the public, even if the jury couldn't hear them. If they were removed from the room, we couldn't hear those things this time because the feeds were turned off. So that was a big issue they raised. McMurray also brought that up when he and I spoke. And then sort of I think the crux of the appeal is that there are federal civil cases that sort of that are U.S. Supreme Court precedent, cases that sort of form the basis of police training, cases where the judges have to give certain instructions to juries who are deciding federal civil cases if a police officer is sued, for example, for shooting someone or for other uses of force. And in this case, the defense had asked the trial judge to give some jury instructions related to federal civil cases, and she declined to do that.
Which is something that judges can do. We should add as well. It's part of the protocol essentially before jury instructions are given for both sides to say these are the instructions that we would like, and then the judge reviews those instructions. That's not necessarily out of the norm here.
Correct. And so in this case, what she did do is she instructed the jury on Alabama's self-defense law and on Alabama's murder statute, because that's what Officer Darby was charged under. And so that's where that kind of issue is on the appeal, is that they wanted her to give specific instructions, essentially special instructions, because he was a police officer. They wanted her to not just tell the jury, you have to consider the perspective of a reasonable person, but of a reasonable police officer. So that's where a lot of the issues on appeal is this idea of special considerations or special instructions for police officers. And so, that's a lot of, what the chief and I talked about. And a lot of what he wrote about in his letter was this federal, civil case precedent from, federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court, that he was concerned about, that stuff not being included in the state criminal court trial.
Well, it's also something to note as well that this judge did not use those instructions that were suggested by Darby's attorneys that were federal jury instructions. This was a state case. Those are completely separate judicial systems. So that's something we should note as well. One thing that Mark McMurray said in your piece this morning that I thought was really interesting is he said essentially that he asked Steve Marshall in the AG's office if a cop had to wait until they had a gun pointed in their face before they used deadly force. So he's presumably alluding to the policy of deadly force at the police station and within the department. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and what exactly the policy is that he's referring to? Again, he said, we have to wait until a cop has a gun in his or her face to use deadly force. What's the state saying about that? And also what are, other police officers saying about that?
So just to give the background here, in this case, the person who was killed, Jeff Parker, he had called police to his home. He had said that he was suicidal and armed and he wanted to kill himself. So two officers arrive before Officer Darby. The first officer later testified against Darby and said that she was trying to de-escalate. She was asking him, why do you want to hurt yourself? She was just, trying to keep him talking, that sort of thing. And then Officer Darby showed up, she said, with his shotgun and essentially just kind of, for lack of a better way to say it, just sort of made the scene chaotic, distracted her from the conversation she was having. And then he comes into the house, and within just seconds of walking in the house, he had, told Mr. Parker to drop the gun, I think 4 times, if I'm remembering correctly. And then he shot him and killed him. And so Mr. Parker had been sitting on the couch with the gun pointed to his head. he had not, pointed the weapon at anybody. But that was one of the specific things I think that the police department and Darby's defense had taken issue with, was that they specifically wanted the jury to be told, you don't have to point a gun at a police officer for them to use force. And that was just not a specific instruction, that was given. And so I think that's really where that question came from. And really the law and the policy are that you can use force if you reasonably believe that you are in imminent danger, or a third party, another person, another officer, whoever is in an imminent danger. And clearly in this case, the jury did not believe that. And that's something that the retired chief and I talked about too. He said, if you're in imminent danger, or if you think you're in imminent danger. And I was like, well, the law, and it says if you reasonably believe that. And clearly the police captains believed Officer Darby, that he, reasonably believed that he was in imminent danger, or that the other officers were, but the jury didn't. And that's just what it comes down to, is, did you reasonably believe that Officer Darby, did you believe that Officer Darby reasonably believed that he or the other officers were in imminent danger?
Well, and something we should note here, and Ashley, you and I have both seen that body cam tape. We've both watched it several times. We also do have parts of that available on AL.com as well. And I know that you included that in your story this morning. So for anybody interested, there are parts of that cam video that are included there. But Ashley, you and I have seen, go ahead.
Actually, I think I included what is Officer Darby's full body cam of the incident.
So we have that available. People can watch it. And again, you and I have spent time watching that. And what is interesting, and I think, again, you kind of touched on a minute ago, was that the first officer who was on the scene, she was inside. She had her hand on what's presumably her gun while she was talking to Mr. Parker and trying to de-escalate the situation. She was already there inside of the house. And again, that couch where Mr. Parker was kind of in the back of that room. She was already in the room talking to Mr. Parker when Darby showed up. And you can see on that body cam footage that officer, that first officer who later testified, she kind of says, look, we've got this. She almost says, don't come in here. Don't make the situation worse. I'm getting this handled. And again, Darby comes in and kind of takes over that situation. But what I think is very interesting is that Mark McMurray, the former police chief here, he says that who violated policy was that first officer, and her forms of de-escalation. And again, she ended up testifying and basically saying that she did not believe she and her fellow officers were in danger. The former police chief says that she was the one who violated policy, and actually says that she was sent to remedial training following that incident, and that Darby was the one who followed everything to a T.
Correct. And not just the first officer, but also the second responding officer. Both of those two were actually the same review board that, cleared Darby. They sent those other two officers to remedial training. And, I think, Chief McMurray, he said that, he really seemed eager to talk about this, honestly. I mean, he said that he felt like he had been vilified for 4 years for standing behind Officer Darby. He felt like he really hadn't had a chance to kind of, tell his account, his side of the story, if you will, because there had been a gag order that was in place in the case, from the time of the indictment or shortly thereafter until after the trial. And so he felt like he really hadn't had a chance to, sort of speak his piece. But, I think a lot of people have said to me sort of, well, it's not really surprising that a police chief would support his officer, right? That, McMurray, the city were just kind of doing what you would expect them to do almost. But I think in that conversation, people forget that that may be true, but not all of the officers who were there that day were supported, by the department. The first officer, she was not. The second officer was not. Both of them have since left the police department. It's also, I think, noteworthy that the investigator who investigated the killing, did like the typical, homicide investigation, criminal investigation of the case was a Huntsville employee, because at the time in Huntsville, the city didn't call in outside agencies like ALEA, the state police, to investigate. The city's own homicide detectives would investigate when their own colleagues, shot and killed somebody. And even the investigator who investigated this case, he no longer works in Huntsville. He has also moved on. He works in the federal government and law enforcement now, or he was at the time of trial last year. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a change. So, I mean, obviously, they determined that Darby did the right thing. They gave him that backing. But there were, other police officers in that department who they didn't get that kind of backing, because it was determined that, they violated policy. So
Right.
I don't know. I just feel like that's at least noteworthy.
Well, I think that most people come away from your article with kind of there's two options here. There's option one, that either this internal review policy got it wrong and that Darby did violate the policy and they got it wrong. There's also option number two that says, well, if he followed policy, then there are some people who would say policies need to be changed because the policy should align with the law. And if the law is going to say, you know what, you committed a offense and again sentence you to 25 years in prison, then that shouldn't fall in line with what police departments policies are. So it seems like there's kind of two conclusions to come out from this.
Correct. Yes. Or really, I mean, I guess there's a third possibility, which I think is kind of what, is being argued in this appeal, which is that, I mean, they would argue that the instructions given, the way state law was presented, that it conflicts with this federal case precedent. Which is what they based the training on. So, I mean, I think that's sort of the three options here. But clearly, if you have somebody who is convicted of murder for a shooting that the police department itself found was within policy, there is a conflict. And I think that has really been the big question ever since the day this indictment came down. I mean, I tried to, sort of address that in a story way back then, like almost 4 years ago now. And obviously, it's hard to get the exact answers, but I mean, there's some sort of conflict there. And hopefully we will learn through this appeal, what that is.
A lot to unpack here. Ashley, thank you for breaking it down for us. Again, all of your reporting, we're going to link here, and that video is also linked inside your reporting on our YouTube channel so that people can watch that and come to their own conclusions as well. Ashley, thank you. I know you're going to be following this appeal process. I know it could be kind of a lengthy process, but again, Darby's been sentenced to 25 years in prison for that murder conviction. So we'll see how the appeal plays out.
Thanks, Ivana.
Thanks, Ashley. Everybody watching, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow.